This is a quick story from when I was growing up in northern Kentucky in the 90s. I would have been right around 10, maybe a little older. I'm in my 30s now, but I vividly remember this happening, and I still think about it all the time. My best friend lived with his grandparents for a bit on several acres of land in Walton, Kentucky, and I spent almost every weekend there. They never really did much with the land. It remained relatively cleared, but there were no farms or structures on it. They had a horse stable near the house, but that was about it. My friend had received a go-kart for his birthday, so we were out driving it around on the open land. It was just the two of us, and we were having a blast riding this thing around. It was getting close to dusk, and we knew we were going to have to pack it in pretty soon. We came to a stop and the engine cut out, and almost at the same time, both of us had this strange feeling come over us. We felt like we were being watched by something. It's weird how our lizard brains can still even process something like this, but we both agreed that there was just this weird overbearing feeling. We hadn't heard his grandpa's truck, and we were too far out to be seen from the house, so we started looking around. We were in an open field in the middle of their land, and it was surrounded by trees and tall brush, but something caught my eye first, and I got my friend to look that same direction. In that brush, we could see a long, almost black shape sitting very still. I know at this point in the story, most of you are thinking Bigfoot. I can say I remember things being dead silent. Even now, I sometimes wonder if it was something else we saw, but all I remember is thinking it was a giant black wolf. I would guess it was maybe 200 feet away from us, trying my best to remember, and it was sitting perfectly still. But to me, anyway, it looked furry. I couldn't make out any other features like ears or eyes, but I swear this was what was making us feel watched. It's like when you see a cat getting ready to pounce. That was what it felt like we were looking at. We were both getting really spooked by this point. The sun was getting down behind the tree line, and one of us was going to have to jump out and pull start the engine back up. We were whispering about what it was that was watching us. Honestly, I forget which one of us jumped out and started the cart back up, but when we looked back at where the black shape was, it was gone. The go-kart didn't have lights, so we drove as fast as we could back to his grandparents' house, and we told them what we saw. His grandpa said we probably saw a coyote or maybe a boar, but the shape was long and low, and I don't know. Coyote just doesn't sit well in my head with what I saw. Not to mention it was pitch black and furry. Every few years I think about this story, and I've read there are no wolves in Kentucky anymore. I think I've just convinced myself it was a coyote or something, but the memory has stuck in my head all this time. Nothing else ever happened on his grandparents' land aside from a really bad car accident a few years later and some missing chickens. Again, coyotes would explain that. And every once in a while, the horses would get really riled up at night. We would go camping on the land and fishing a lot, and we had a lot of fun around there. Anyway, this is my short little spooky story, and I wish I had more bite to it, but it's 100% what happened. A friend and I saw something several years back. It was very thin, and its skin looked as if it had a full-body latex suit on. Very shiny. Bone structure in its face, but had no eyes or orifices. You could see the ribs. Head was elongated and fingers long and pointy. Had a peculiar-looking gait to it. This was late at night, and the creature was directly under a security light in my friend's backyard. We had been sitting quietly in his truck. This thing walked up, not noticing us. Maybe 15 feet in front of us, directly under the security light. My friend screamed and it jumped and faced us. It then took off towards the woods. We had been gone for a while and were just sitting in the driveway chilling before we went in. We had actually pushed the truck to the house because we had ran out of gas right before we got back to his house. We finally got brave enough to run into the house, but the door was locked and he didn't have a key because he never locked the house. Then we go around the house to try to get through his bedroom window, only to find that it was open. Not only was it open, but the screen was wadded up and shredded on the ground. Anyone have any idea what this thing could have been? This was in 1996 or 97. I've never been able to figure it out. Just so that you have an idea of my background, knowledge, and experience, I grew up all over the rural southern U.S., from the Appalachian Mountains to the swamps, backwoods and bayous of the deep south, where I spent most of my free time deep in the woods up into my early 20s. I spent a lot of my time hiking, camping, hunting, and fishing, and have always felt at home and at peace, miles from nowhere. The more remote, the better. I'm well educated. I have a degree in a field of science, and have seen various types of wildlife like coyotes, wolves, panthers, and bears in the wild. When I was about 17, my family moved to the Florida Panhandle. The woods in that area and around my house went on for many, many miles, and are only interrupted by the occasional creek, river, country road, or farm. There really are many miles of woods that see very little traffic out there. I was told by the locals that the area around my house had special significance to the Native Americans, and on a few occasions people alluded to things being odd in that area, but no one ever told me anything specific. If anything, the few who seemed to know anything got weird and quiet if I pressed them about why they made remarks about the woods, so I dismissed it and lived my outdoor life as I normally would. On one occasion, some friends came over to our property, and we decided to go camping. We went down to one of the creek bottoms a mile behind the house, and hung out for a while, but after remembering all of the water moccasins that hung out down there, I decided against camping out there, out of concern that I might get bit by a snake in the dark. There were a lot of cottonmouths down there, and they become more active at night. So around dusk, I and another kid went back to the house, and the other two were going to camp out for the night. Probably an hour after dark, the other two showed up looking shaken. They said that they were going to sleep inside too. They seemed spooked, but when I asked them if something was wrong, they got weird and clammed up. The next day, we went back to the creek bottom to goof around and do teenage stuff. One of my friends had brought his rifle, which he seemed eager to try out. It was one of those old Chinese SKSs. We were messing around the campsite they had abandoned the night before, when one of them commented about seeing something that looked like the invisible thing from the movie Predator. I thought they were being silly, but they were insistent, so we looked around and saw nothing. A little while later, the friend with the rifle fired a shot up into the trees, which was immediately followed by a huge splash in the creek. When I looked at the creek, I saw large waves from the impact, like someone had thrown something really big into it with a lot of force. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw something brown and blurry in the creek, but before my eyes could even focus on it, nothing was there to be seen, yet there were the waves, still moving. It was weird. I was surprised. I didn't know that he had intended to shoot at anything and had been looking the other way. My other friends didn't seem to know what had just happened either. We asked him what just happened, and he said, "I saw a large hairy thing up in that large limb of the tree and shot it." I know that was absolutely irresponsible of him. I asked him what he just shot. Was it a raccoon or something? No, he said. It looked like something out of a zoo, kind of like a big monkey or something, but it had a face and it was looking at me. I must have hit it because it fell into the creek. All of this happened in less than a minute, and we ran the 25 feet over to the creek where we had all heard the splash. There was still a slight disturbance in the water, but we never saw anything. When I questioned the friend, he reiterated that he saw a hairy thing that reminded him of something similar to a baboon, looking at him from on top of a large limb of the tree, but he repeated, it had a face and it was looking at him. I asked him, "What do you mean it had a face? Like a human face?" He said no. It wasn't human, but it didn't look like any animal's face that he had ever seen. It didn't look like a monkey's face either. It was different. We searched the banks and looked around, but didn't find anything. We even walked down the creek a good ways to see if he had killed something and it had floated away. We never found anything, no blood, no tracks, no fur. But whatever had happened, he had irresponsibly shot at something, and even if out of surprise, it had fallen into the creek, but we never found any sign of it. It was shortly after this that things started feeling weird, a little eerie, and we called it a day. I never knew what to think of that event, and I think I had written it off as something that either just didn't make sense or some kind of crazy yet very successful prank. I even asked the other two guys if they were screwing with me, and they swore that they hadn't done anything. One of them did see him fire the rifle, but didn't know what he was shooting at. He said he saw something fall in his peripheral vision, but when he looked in the creek, there wasn't anything there. Life continued on as normal, and I spent a lot of my free time hiking, exploring, and looking for fishing holes off of that small creek. At some point after this, I started having weird experiences in the woods periodically. Sometimes, usually late in the day or at dusk, I would get the feeling that I was being watched. The feeling wasn't there most of the time. It would just happen on occasion. I started noticing that sometimes in the evening, I would hear strange animal noises from the surrounding woods. A few times it sounded like a blood-curdling scream. Once it sounded like a roar. And a few other times it sounded like some type of odd bird-like cry, similar to a peacock. Being familiar with animals, I always tried to deduce what animal had made the various noises. I concluded that the screams must be a panther, that the roar must have been a bear, but the peacock noises made no sense. There were 3 neighbors within the next mile and a half on that isolated road, and none of them had peacocks. Then late one evening, I heard a more intimidating scream than before. It just sounded bizarre and caused me a sense of fear and dread. The scream sounded like a woman being murdered. I don't know how else to describe it. It was high-pitched, shrill, and loud, but it seemed too loud and lasted too long to be a human. I figured it must have been a panther, but it didn't feel right and sent chills down my spine. It was during the last bit of twilight before total darkness, and I hurried my butt back to my house. Sometime after that, the occasional sense of being watched and followed began to feel stronger and more malevolent. On a couple of occasions after that, when I was out in the woods, I felt that I was not just being watched, I was being hunted, and that my life was in danger. I never saw or heard anything. The woods were always silent when this happened, and I was always quick to make my way back home, but made a point to walk as I felt running might trigger a predator like a panther to chase me, if that's what it was. Whatever it was, I felt like I was in imminent danger of death. It was a consuming feeling like nothing that I've ever felt. One day during this time, my little brother and his friends came running excitedly up to me and told me that 2 of them had just seen a bear. Being that this area had been heavily hunted for many years, and there were not supposed to be any bears anywhere near this part of Florida, I asked them what they saw. They said they had turned around and seen the hind end of something on all 4s, walking into the edge of the forest. They only saw the very end of the creature and could only see the upper part of the back legs and its back right above the legs. They said that it was brown, it had hair, and that it was much bigger than a dog, so it must have been a bear. Again, there are no bears known to exist anywhere near there. At some point after this, I was out hiking again one day and had made a point to bring my shotgun loaded with number 4 shot, which was the largest pellets that I had. I had begun carrying it when hiking as a precaution to whatever was out there. I was still leaning towards it being a panther. I didn't know what else it could be that would stalk a human and go undetected. I had noticed that the strange feelings and various strange sounds seemed to happen around dusk or at night, so I had started making a point to get back home well before dark. This time I had stayed out too late. Dusk was beginning as I was making my way home when I felt it again. Something was watching me. No, it felt like something was after me. The level of fear and the senses that this thing triggered were completely different from anything that I'd ever felt. I knew I was being stalked, but I couldn't see or hear anything as I made my way home. Whatever the thing was, it seemed to move with me as I had walked hundreds of yards, but the feeling had only grown stronger. I felt like my life was in peril, like something was about to lunge out and kill me. Every hair on my body seemed to be standing up, and I felt certain that whatever it was, that shotgun wasn't going to stop it. Despite the terror I was feeling, I forced myself to stop and scan the woods, looking at both the ground and the trees, thinking that I might see a panther nearby readying itself to pounce on me. There was nothing that I could see or hear. Everything was deathly quiet. It was about at this time that I first remember an inner voice saying something like, "Don't stop. Go. Quick. Don't run." I started praying as I walked to the house. In every fiber of my being, I felt a sense of malice and intent. Whatever this was, it wanted to kill me. I felt sheer terror, sheer dread, in a way I had never felt in my now 17 years. Remember, I grew up in very rural areas full of remote, isolated spots. Those places were where I felt most at peace. Animals didn't scare me, but whatever this was did. That feeling was terrifying and consuming. It was all that I could do to walk home, clutching my useless shotgun, praying to God to protect me. And he did. Usually, when I got within 200 to 300 yards of my house, the feeling would subside. This time, the feeling followed me right up to about 50 yards from my home. I continued praying, and as I reached the house, the feelings eased off, but I felt like whatever it was nearby watching. From that day on, I started occasionally feeling a malevolent presence emanating from the nearby woods. Sometimes it didn't feel safe in my own yard at night. I remember one time when I walked into the backyard and heard the scream again. It sounded like a woman screaming in terror, only extremely loud, and it lasted too long to be a human, and then it transitioned to something like a baby crying, but the crying changed to become distorted and twisted, and it just felt and sounded like something that was wicked was trying to frighten me. From that point on, I avoided the woods, especially when alone or in the evenings. I had turned to partying and tried to push the events from my mind. A year or two had passed without incident, and I had gotten too relaxed. Sometimes I get the occasional itch to go for a stroll at night. This night, the moon was mostly full. The sky was clear with lots of stars. It was a bright, beautiful, early autumn night. I still had enough apprehension to stay out of the fields and woods, especially alone at night, so I decided to go for a walk down the rural country road. It was probably around midnight. I'd walked several hundred yards down the paved road and cut across the corner of someone's cow pasture to get to a dirt road. I had gone through an electric fence and had made it about 50 yards through the pasture when I heard something moving in the adjacent cornfield on the opposite side of the dirt road from the pasture. I stopped and listened, and heard the sound of something big moving quickly through the corn rows. At first, I thought it might be a deer, until I realized that the steps and movements sounded bipedal and large. Several times it moved, and then paused, then moved through the corn quickly again. After hearing the movement several times, suddenly the sound of movement was followed by the sound of a rabbit squealing. I instinctively crouched, peering into the darkness. Up until this moment, I had only been curious as to what kind of animal I had gotten close to. I had no way of fathoming what was about to step out. I saw a large bipedal figure walk out of the cornfield. It crossed the dirt road and stepped over the electric fence mid-stride without pause or effort. In the bright light of the moon and stars, I could make out some details. Its head had significant wolf-like features, a long snout and pointed ears. It was taller than a human, maybe 7 feet, possibly a little more, and it walked leaning forward with its shoulders hunched forward, like it was slightly crouched. It was covered in hair, but the hair seemed thinner or shorter on much of its torso and arms. I remember noticing it had a very lean, powerful, muscular build. Its arms seemed unusually long and hung low as it moved, and it clutched something in one of what appeared to be long hands. I couldn't make out its color because of the limited light. It just appeared dark-colored. I never noticed a tail or whether it had the double knees these creatures are often portrayed as having. Despite being a semi-bright night, a lot of its body from the waist down was obscured in shadow. It crouched on the ground, clutching the rabbit in both hands, and I started hearing wet and crunching noises and realized that it was eating the rabbit. It was squatting low on the ground, holding it with both of its hands, eating it like you might eat a fried chicken drumstick and thigh with 2 hands. At this point, I guess it couldn't have been more than 40 yards from me. It's hard to remember details you didn't think about at the time many years later. I had on a camouflage jacket and jeans, and I remember trying to make myself small while crouching and hoping it wouldn't notice me, when it paused and sniffed as if smelling something. Then it raised its head up and sniffed the air. It was at that moment that I thought, crap, I hope it isn't smelling my scent. And then it looked directly at me and emitted this low guttural growl, and I swear its eyes flashed red, something that I've never seen an animal do without a light reflecting in them. It was less bright than when a light reflects directly in an animal's eyes, but distinct enough I could see the red eyes briefly flicker in the darkness. This didn't appear to be reflected light. It appeared to come from the creature for a split second, and then disappeared. Bizarre, I know. Looking directly at me, the creature stood up like it was challenging me, and growled this low guttural growl that I heard from 40 yards away. At that moment, I felt fear overwhelm me. I had this overwhelming urge to haul ass back to my house, but something inside, something told me not to run, that if I did, it would catch me and kill me. When I previously mentioned all of the times I felt hunted, and I felt a sense of unnatural terror like my life was about to be forfeit in the most sudden and violent way, well, now it was like I was looking at the source, eye to eye. Somehow I knew that this creature was a bad, wicked thing, far more powerful than me, and something like an inaudible voice kept telling me if I ran, my life was forfeit. Walk, don't run, pray, stay calm. These thoughts kept going through my head, but they weren't coming from my conscious mind. I slowly backed out of the field, never turning my back to the creature until briefly when I had to cross the electric fence. Even then, I tried not to turn my back completely to it and keep an eye on it. At this point, it had moved deeper into the shadows of the pasture and was moving parallel to the direction I was going. I would occasionally hear it moving through the field, still staying parallel to me as I had begun to walk down the paved road towards my home. As I moved down the blacktop, I came to a section of woods with no houses or lights nearby. I had to walk through at least a few hundred yards of wooded road to get back to my house, and there was only one house on the way, no lights anywhere, and nothing but woods. The thing tracked alongside me the whole time, moving through the woods in the darkness with absolute ease. Occasionally I would hear a branch crack or the swish of vegetation, and a few times it stopped to growl that low guttural growl at me. It's odd how I could hear it growl. I don't think I would have heard a dog growling at that distance. The entire time I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, fear, and imminent, inescapable death. I continued to listen to the internal voice and prayed hard the whole way. It kept telling me to walk, not to run, and to pray. I prayed. Oh, did I pray. I don't know if it was the voice or my intuition, but I somehow knew with absolute certainty that if I ran, it would kill me. There was something symbolic about the act of fleeing from this evil, and I knew if I did, everything was over. As I walked through the dark wooded stretch of road, I remember wondering if any of my remains would be found, and if so, what they would claim did it. I kept feeling like I was going to be killed at any moment. Time seemed to drag on. It seemed like forever until I got close to my house. I finally reached my driveway and even walked backwards up a hill to my house, because I still didn't want to turn my back to it. Sure enough, it was across the road from my house, growling from the edge of the tree line and bushes. I finally bolted when I got about 10 yards from my door. I ran through the house, locking doors, and grabbed my old shotgun, even though I felt certain that the small game loads I had in it wouldn't do anything but piss the thing off. I was too afraid to look out the windows, as I knew it was outside and feared seeing it looking back at me through the windows. The feeling this thing gave me was not just a dangerous one. It was an evil feeling, like this was a wicked, unnatural thing. I sat in my room and prayed, if memory serves, until about dawn. A few weeks or months later, sorry, I can't remember the specifics, my little sister came downstairs, sometimes around or after 1 a.m., white as a ghost and panic-stricken. She was terrified. You could see it all over her. When I asked my family what was wrong, they told me she had seen a bear crouching outside of her window. She had woken up to a terrifying feeling, knew something was watching her sleep, and when she looked at the window next to her bed, she saw a bear with big red eyes staring at her. My sister slept in a bedroom on the second floor, but the garage adjoining that part of the house was one story. Something had climbed up on the roof of the garage and had been intently watching her through the window. I asked her point blank if she was sure it was a bear. I could tell she was terrified and didn't want to acknowledge something. She responded with, "It was covered in hair, had big red eyes, and was staring at me sleeping through the window. I was asleep when I woke up with a feeling of terror. I knew something was watching me. It felt like it was bad." I'm of course paraphrasing this as it was many years ago. I was generally too afraid to go back in the woods around my house after that. But when I did summon up the courage, I would periodically have to abruptly stop hikes in the woods near the house. Everything would be fine, and then I would suddenly become overwhelmed with the ominous feeling that I was living on borrowed time, that the creature was stalking me, and that it was about to kill me. I almost always left immediately, feeling like the shotgun in my hands that I carried was useless. On multiple occasions when this happened, I felt the inner voice again, telling me to leave now, walk, don't run, and to pray. On the couple of occasions that I lingered momentarily to scan the woods for the creature, I never saw anything, but it felt like it grew closer, and the danger grew more imminent, so I always left. It was around this time that I found someone's white domestic rabbit hanging from a tree branch in the woods, disemboweled and with its eyes plucked out. It was hanging from a branch about 5 feet off the ground. It struck me that it was like it was meant to be seen or found, as it was placed in a highly visible location right beside. It struck me that it was like it was meant to be seen/found, as it was placed in a highly visible location right behind someone's property line at eye level, at the edge of a field beside the woods where this thing seemed to frequent. It just seemed significant. It was about that time that I learned that Native Americans lived on the nearby adjacent property who were reputed to use blood magic. That was evil and bad stuff. I was told this by another Native American who told me to stay away from them. I'm part Native too. We lived near a reservation, and multiple natives had told me about someone who was known as a shapeshifter, someone who had purportedly demonstrated their ability to shift into animals, and they had ties to this family. The few times someone told me something like that, they always acted like it was a taboo thing that they should not be speaking of. I don't know if it's relevant, but it feels like it all might be connected. A couple of years later, a friend of mine came to pick me up to take me to a nearby city. We pulled out of my driveway after midnight, and right down the road from my house, we saw a pair of huge wolves standing a few feet from the road, calmly watching us, even staring at the car from a few feet away as we passed. Their presence and behavior seemed and felt very unnatural, and my friend, who had grown up there, freaked out. He became pale, sweaty, and started stuttering, telling me, "Those are wolves. Those are huge." The only wolves in Florida are a few red wolves, which almost look like coyotes. They have reddish-brown coloring and are very small for a wolf. These individuals were silver, gray, and black, and if I had to guess, they looked to weigh about 140 and 180 pounds. One was smaller than the other, and when I looked at them, I instinctively knew they were a pair, one male, one female. The red wolves aren't present anywhere near that part of Florida panhandle, and this was something entirely different. I questioned my uncle, a state biologist and a huge outdoorsman, and he told me there were very few red wolves in Florida. They were nowhere near that size, and there were none anywhere near me. Similarly, there weren't any red-eyed, roof-sitting, window-peering bears in the area, as all bears in the area had been hunted out many years ago. I don't know what the true nature of what I experienced was, but it always left me with the sense that it had a very strong supernatural element. Yes, these things had physical forms, but there was something more, something supernatural. My friend knew something, but he was so terrified that all he would tell me is that there were natives in the area and that part of the woods was special to them. And then he would get an even more terrified look, clam up, and change the subject. He used to have a house in that immediate area, and he said strange things happened. There was something bad around the house, something in those woods. He said that their house mysteriously burnt down one day when no one was even home. They had it rebuilt and it caught on fire and burned down a second time when no one was home. Whatever happened spooked him and was so scary that they bought a new home many miles away, and he was spooked to even think about it. When locals told me of natives who were purportedly shifters, I began researching and learned that many tribes had beliefs of dark magic that would allow them to transform, much like Skinwalkers. These rituals are always dark rituals that involve blood, sacrifice, or some other dark or evil deeds. After that, I just stayed completely out of the woods around the house, and I didn't walk further than the barn behind the house at night. There were still several incidences, more loud piercing screams in the night. Once or twice I heard a baby crying out in the woods during the middle of the night. As I thought to myself, that's no baby. Something is trying to lure me out there or screw with me. The sound changed from the very distinctive sound of a baby into something wicked and unnatural, almost like an evil, twisted mockery of the sound of a baby crying. I felt that it was literally trying to mess with me, trying to instill terror and let me know that it was there. One time I had to talk my brother and a friend out of going into the woods to look for the baby. And again, as soon as everyone agreed that there couldn't possibly be a baby crying that loudly in the woods in the middle of the night, the sound changed into something wicked which would curdle your blood. There was also another occasion where we heard puppies crying out from a ditch in the edge of the woods in the middle of the night. Once again, a couple of friends wanted to rush out there to rescue the puppies. And once again, as soon as I pointed out that it couldn't possibly be puppies out there in the woods in the middle of the night, in BFE, the sound changed, and it was always a wicked, terrifying sound, almost like some evil thing was trying to create the most disturbing sounds it could. Shortly after, I moved away, and rarely visited that home, and all of my encounters of this nature ended when I left. Years later, the house was sold. To cut an extremely long story short, my friend used to live in a house that was well in the woods. One day he told me something was happening around his house, so I spent the night. We sat with our backs to the wall, and the window cracked just a bit. We were on the second story. As we were talking, we started hearing strange noises coming from the woods. We were shocked as we peeked to see what it was. Between his house and the woods was a big open area. We could faintly see the open area because of moonlight, but we couldn't see the pitch blackness of the woods. Suddenly, some large white creature that looked like a naked man creeped out. It was bald and its eyes were glowing. When we freaked out, I yelped a bit too loud, causing it to stop and go back into the woods. The next day, being the curious people we were, we decided to go out into the woods and search. Eventually, we found a strange uprooted tree with a bunch of holes in the ground. We heard heavy breathing coming from inside somewhere, but we decided not to go in there looking. A few weeks went by and nothing. I came back to his house just to sleep over. He asked me to go grab one of his bikes off the back porch. I went back there through the garage, but as I was grabbing it, I felt like something was watching me. I looked off towards the woods, but saw nothing. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise literally over my head. I looked up at the roof, which was only about 7 feet off the ground in that section of the house, due to the elevation of the porch, and I saw a similar creature sitting on the roof just feet from my face. When I panicked, it shrieked in my face and I ran back into the garage and slammed the door shut. My friend ran into the garage from inside the house to see what had happened, and I was panicking, telling him to lock everything. We locked ourselves inside and waited for his dad to come back. This was around 6 or 8 p.m. I don't remember exactly, but it was closer to the night. His dad was in the military and decided to step out and take a look after he came home, and we told him what had happened. He saw that same creature in the distance just on the edge of the woods, but had no explanation for it. It's been 5 years since that happened, and now I've been seeing sightings of things just like it all over the place. YouTube, Reddit, Facebook, etc. It's really been haunting me lately thinking back on that sound it made when it shrieked, and the way that thing looked. It was terrifying. Its eyes seemed very strange too. I kind of tied two and two together and figured it must be living beneath the ground and only comes up when it's dark. I think I keep encountering a fleshgate/humanoid creature, and I'm scared it's for a reason. Keep in mind, I live on an Ojibwe reservation in a very rural area in northern Wisconsin that is heavily wooded. One night, 2 summers ago, I was coming back from my grandparents' house with my ex-boyfriend when we saw this thing on the side of the road that looked like a naked person with its back turned to us. Its skin wasn't like a normal human. It was more like buckskin. It didn't move. We both saw it and freaked out. We still would talk about it sometimes, but we didn't see anything else after that. Until tonight. I'm a wreck. We have finally broken up. He kicked me out. I was driving to my grandparents' alone with my cats and all of my shit packed into my car. I saw reflective eyes and thought deer, so I slowed down, but it wasn't a deer. I could have honestly written it off as that if its upper body hadn't moved. It was on 2 legs, tall, muscular, and had that same buckskin appearance. Now there's no way this was a person. It was freezing rain and in the middle of nowhere. I'm scared it might recognize me. Has anyone else experienced this?